Anybody remember that shouldn't have Hershey bars? So, chapter 2 is called In the Navy. So when we left out, my dad had just volunteered to join the Navy. And his best friend, his trouble in crime that tried to chop down the tree, he decided to join him. So my dad's expertise out on the shooting range, it really showed, as he received the highest ranking of expert marksman. That's the highest ranking you can get in the Navy, which is pretty amazing. If anybody has done the rifle rep here, that's the equivalent of standing and getting nothing but 40s. Nasty scores, nasty scores. He was assigned to a newly commissioned aircraft carrier named the USS Phillipine Sea. And its maiden voyage was basically up to San Francisco to take some dignitaries out and float around a little bit. My dad was, because of his experience, repairing engines and stuff, they placed him in the engine room. He was a boilerman first class, which means he basically makes sure the engines keep running. The Philippine Sea is an interesting ship because it was one of the first U.S. aircraft carriers that actually launched and landed fighter jets. So, right about, I don't know, halfway through their little tour of San Francisco, where they were showing dignitaries out and taking them on cruises around out there, the Korean War broke out. This is in 1950, and the carrier was the closest thing to Korea at the time. So they quickly rushed back in to drop off all their passengers. They went over to the Concord Naval Air Station and got their munitions. They got some planes on the way. They went down to San Diego to get their Marines, because every aircraft carrier needs to have a complement of Marines. But they weren't really ready for it because they weren't expecting this ship to be needed so quickly. So when they got to San Diego, they took whatever Marines they could find. And most of those, literally they did, most of those were MPs that weren't already assigned to another ship. And so they basically just had a ragtag set of MPs. They didn't even have all the, my dad was with two other boilermen down in the engine room. These things have a lot of engines. 3 people can't do a whole, So my dad, on the way to Korea, he spent the entire time training MPs how boilers work. Right? That's the Navy back then. Right? It was just after the war, World War II ended, and they were doing whatever they could. So my dad trained the MPs, and right about this time they got there. They were doing some aircraft were doing bombings and things, and my dad was involved in the first landing of Incheon. He was in the first wave at Incheon. Now, if you know anything about Incheon, historically, in comparison to the D-Day raids, it was not as bad. There were only, I think in the first wave, there were only 14 people that got killed. Unfortunately, one of those 14 was my dad's best friend. So that's the bad news. My dad made it through though okay, and the landing in Incheon was considered a huge success. He returned to shipboard duty following Incheon. And one day he was working in the engine room and he was summoned to the captain's quarters. Well, troublemaker dad thought he'd done something wrong. He's like, God, I don't know what I did. So he arrives in the captain's quarters, and there's 2 men in there with him. And my dad didn't recognize these guys. And the captain has my dad's file open. He says, it says here in your file that you're an expert marksman. My dad, yes sir, yes sir. My dad got introduced to these 2 other gentlemen. One was a U.S. Marine, and the other was a British sapper. Now, the British sappers are the ones that go in, and they're kind of like Seabees, if you know what Seabees are. They go in and they build bridges, they remove munitions, they basically go in and they cause trouble for the enemy. They plant, they blow up bridges or they build bridges. That's the type of stuff they did. So my dad was told, you're going to be needed on a joint 1-day mission. And what was happening was the North Koreans went, so every day there would be an air raid on this area that the Americans were trying to take over. And every day when they do the air raid, the North Koreans would hide in this great big railway tunnel. And so they devised a plan that they would go in and they would plant munitions around the railway tunnel. The airplanes would come in, they'd drop their bombs, everybody would hide in the tunnel, and then they'd blow up the munitions and trap everybody in the tunnel. Sounds like a pretty simple plan. So the reason my dad got called up is because the Marines, the guy who was supposed to be their sniper, well, it turns out he had appendicitis the night before the raid. So they needed a sniper. My dad's an expert marksman, natural, right? So my dad gets called up, never been trained for this stuff, right? So my dad gets called up, and he's going on this midnight raid. They're going to detonate the stuff and then return to the ship. It's supposed to be less than 24 hours away from ship. Everything was going well. They got launched from submarines on rubber rafts, just like you see in the movies, and in the middle of the night. They go up on the beach. They hide their rafts. They go up, and the British sappers went up and they planted all their munitions, and then the sappers jumped back on their boats and headed back out. The Marines were supposed to stay there, and they were the ones that were going to detonate it all. So the next day, the air raid comes in. Everything is going great. They've been completely undetected so far. The air raid comes in, dropping the bombs. Everybody hides in the tunnel. They blow up the tunnel. Everything's working great. They start to make their escape, and it turns out there's a North Korean company that's right in the way back to their boats. They don't have an option. They can't go that way now. So instead, they decide to go the other way. They communicated their predicament to the ship, and they decided, there were about 15 of them, I guess, they decided to head the opposite direction from the coast that they just came in on. And so they traveled inland. They split up into small groups of 2 or 3, because if you have a group of 15 people traveling through a forest, they're going to make a big footprint. So they split up into smaller groups so they were less likely to be caught and less likely to be seen. They traveled only at night. During the day, they would just hide out. And every day, there would be a bombing raid. And the pilots would fly over, and as soon as they got over where they were at, they would click their radio one time. Because so far, the North Koreans didn't even know they were there. They just assumed that somebody blew it up, and oh my gosh. So they were still undetected. So they couldn't communicate at all on the radio, because if there was an American voice heard, or an English voice, I'm sorry, heard over the radios, they were dust. So nobody was really searching for them yet. So the plane would fly over, and they go click, and that would tell the pilot where they were located. The pilot would then go and do his bombing run, and then the pilot would turn around, and then as he would go over that same spot, he would fly in the direction that they were supposed to travel the next night. That's how they knew where to go and how to work their way around. So every day they did this. They had orders among themselves that if they were to see anybody, if anybody was to see them, they had to kill them because they were undetected. They couldn't be caught. So as they snaked their way around the Korean peninsula, they ate whatever they could find. My dad ate worms, bugs, whatever they could eat. They're highly protein. They got a lot of protein. If you watch Survivor, you find that out. And every once in a while, they would come across an abandoned hut. They came across one that looked like there was some rice that was cooking. They went up and they stole some rice and they got that. They basically ate whatever they could. One night, my dad got separated from his other his partners as they were traveling, and he came across a young boy. Orders were, kill anybody that sees you. My dad couldn't do it. Nobody could, right? I couldn't do it. So instead, my dad reached into a pocket, and a Hershey bar probably saved a lot of lives that night. My dad opened it up, he went like this. The little kid's just staring at it. He opened up the candy bar very slowly. Made sure that the wrapper wouldn't get left with the kid. Couldn't have any evidence. Put the wrapper in his pocket. Reached down. The little kid smiled at him. Have no idea what happened to that kid. But that candy bar probably saved the 15 Marines' life, and my dad, and that little boy's life. Pretty incredible. So, after about 30 more days of traveling across like this, and over 100 miles, they finally reached the other coastline, and they were extracted again by submarine-launched dinghies. They made it all the way to the ship. My dad said to me the other day, that was the longest day of my life. So, upon returning to the ship, Upon returning to the ship, the reality of what he had just done suddenly hit him. And you can imagine, the post-traumatic stress you have after experiencing something like that. His mental state was definitely concerned. So they put him on the next mail plane that was going to be heading off to land. Now, on a big aircraft carrier like this, there's a couple thousand people, and they generate a lot of mail. And the mail planes only went out once a month. So this plane was loaded up with mail for a whole month, and my dad and the pilot. And it's taken off on this aircraft carrier. And as soon as it gets over the edge, it starts down. Now, if you're a pilot, you know that's actually kind of normal. But if you're a guy that works in the boiler room and you haven't seen that, you don't know they do that. So my dad probably needed a new pair of shorts after that. He managed to make it up, made it to safety, and thank goodness for that. So that's the end of chapter 2, and I'll be back with chapter 3 in a few minutes.